Every question about whether Christianity is true or whether Jesus really was God or really did come back from the dead, they all come back to whether we can trust the Bible or not. Every moral, ethical, and theological debate among Christians comes back to how we view and interpret the Bible. So it seems we ought to have some confidence that the Bible itself is trustworthy. But how do you know? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about on today's episode of Theology on Air. Welcome back to Theology on Air. We are an offshoot of Theology by the Pint, a ministry in Houston, Texas, where we get together over good craft beer and juicy topics around theology and culture wars and philosophy and all kinds of things. But the beer helps us have a sense of humor and a good time while we argue with each other about those things. If you're in the Houston area and you're interested in coming to one of our events, go to theologybythepint.org to find out when our next events are. And if you're outside the Houston area, well, that's why we have the podcast, so that we can go deeper into some of these topics and everybody, not just Houstonians, gets to listen and weigh in. And so if you like the podcast, we always ask that you consider to help us grow, to sponsor us. Even a little bit helps. So you can also find out about how to give at theologybythepint.org. Everything you need to know is at theologybythepint.org. So now that we got that out of the way, we are joined today. This is, I'll tell you in a second, the funny way that this came about, but we're joined by our new friend, Dr. Lydia McGrew. She is a widely published analytic philosopher and author. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. And she's published extensively in the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology. That's a big word, but you guys should know by now what that means. And in its application to the evaluation of testimony and to the philosophy of religion. Excuse me. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in 4 books, including The Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John as historical reportage, and Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. And if memory serves, you have a new book that's going to be coming out. Yes?
No, Testimonies is the latest book.
Is the latest book. Okay. And we'll be talking about that some today. Okay. Well, you said don't share it. So I thought maybe it was still, under wraps and editors had to look at it. But this episode kind of came about in a funny way because we had somebody else on, we'll name him later, but a really enjoyable conversation about the validity of the Gospels. But you guys, will get into this at the end. I'm going to make people wait for the spicy stuff, but you guys have a difference of opinion about how you view this. And we asked him about this kind of beef that you guys have. And we asked him to steel man your thoughts on it. Steel man, of course, being this idea where you represent somebody else's ideas, even if they're not your own. And then you emailed us and said, I don't think he steel manned it as well as maybe he thought. That's not exactly what I think. And so we thought, well, let's have her on. And so I'm excited to hear from you. And but we're going to go back to the beginning before we get into all the beef, and just ask you a little bit before we get into what you write about and what you believe. Just tell us a little bit about who you are. How did you come to faith? And then how did you come to be interested in this field at all?
I was raised in a Christian home from, infancy onward. And my husband, Tim, and I were married in 1986. We, after he got his degree from Vanderbilt in philosophy, he and I were writing in epistemology. We co-wrote quite a bit, and in the philosophy of religion. That work brought us to the attention of William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, and they tapped us to write an article on the resurrection of Jesus for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology in the early 00s. And so we're going back approximately 20 years at this point. When we wrote that, we realized that we were diverging somewhat from the common minimal facts approach to the argument for the resurrection. And one of the biggest ways in which our approach differed was that we were really focusing on the details of what the disciples said. Like they said in detail that they were able to touch Jesus. Jesus, appeared to them in bodily form and all the, specific, like the doubting Thomas story, that these at least were part of their claims, and that's part of what needed to be explained. And so we realized that for that purpose, the reliability of the Gospels is important, because if that stuff was added later, then it wasn't part of their claims to begin with. It was just something that got kind of added on, like Bart Ehrman's by a telephone game. So Tim subsequently received a grant to work on older apologetics and older debates of the deist controversy going back a couple hundred years. And in the course of that, he became aware of the argument from undesigned coincidences for the Gospels. He made me aware of it. I published a book on it in that came out in early 2017. That was my first book in New Testament. From 2016 to 2017, I became aware of some of the views of Dr. Lacona and also, though, Craig Evans. In 2017, some comments came to light again that Evans had made in 2012, but they just kind of came back up like things do on the internet, uh, kind of downplaying the literal historicity of the Gospel of John. And
Hmm.
in the aftermath, in the context of that, I realized, wow, there's a surprising set of people thought of as conservative who are willing to accept some of that the authors sometimes changed facts. And
Hmm.
I had never been made aware of that to that extent. I had been aware of Dr. Lacona himself, but then I didn't know about Evans, for example, until then, and
Hmm.
some other people. That prompted me to delve yet deeper into New Testament studies and to do crossover work with my work in probability theory. All this time, I'm publishing, even on my own, not just co-publishing with Tim, in analytic philosophy, probability theory, math, hard stuff. And I began doing a lot of crossover work there. And that led to my subsequent three books in New Testament studies. So
Yeah.
if you think that was wordy, that's the short version. But there you
Well,
go. That's the short version.
no, we appreciate the short version, but you said a lot of things that, so some of our listeners are geeking out because they know these names and they know these words, but some of our listeners were like, "Whoa, she lost me at epistemology."
Mhm.
So just maybe I can try to put the cookies on the bottom shelf. It sounds like you entered into the space of apologetics, especially around the reliability of the Gospels, but there was already a contingent of people that had kind of, you mentioned the minimal facts. That's Gary Habermas, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
Habermas, William Lane Craig is an apologist a lot of people know of. He talks a
Mhm.
lot about, evidences for Christianity or for
Mhm.
theism rather,
Mhm.
um,
And Christianity.
in
Yeah.
Christianity. But
Yeah.
anyway, and then of course, Dr. Mike Lacona, which I wasn't going to use his name till later. I was going to make people wait for the juicy part,
Oh,
but you said
sorry.
it. No, that's okay.
I'm not trying to be
Um,
too juicy. It's just part of the story.
sure. But those are all people that are in sort of one camp. And you started to realize that the way that they were coming to the defense of the gospels isn't exactly how you would do it. Is that kind of a easy way to say it?
Yes, or the extent to which they would come to the
Yeah.
defense of the Gospels wasn't as far as I would go. Yeah.
Yeah. And by
And
the way, I meant to say this during the intro. This has nothing to do with the Gospels, but if you're watching this on YouTube and you see that Dr. McGrew is laying down or reclined, it's not because she's bored and she's about to take a nap. We are very exciting. It's because she has a chronic pain issue. So that's just to explain in case you're like, oh, they're getting real relaxed on Theology on Air over there. Okay. So yeah, I only wanted to do that just in case we were starting to lose people. I don't
Sure.
want to lose people because what you are doing is really fascinating. I mean, the question, like I said in the intro, is can you believe any of this? I mean, in the modern world we live in, people think it's a ridiculous notion to believe this text that's thousands of years old. I mean, and written by a variety of people, and then there's all this kind of questioning about all of that, right? You talked about the game of telephone. Bart Ehrman is a name that you said he's somebody that I think has led a lot of people away from Christianity and believing the Bible,
sure.
and people in my own life. So when
Uh,
you?
No, I wanted to raise my hand. Although when I did read Bart Ehrman in college, I did walk away from the faith for a couple of years.
Okay.
So I don't count on that as part of the story or anything, but yes, it's true. So, but I did want to ask, because we talk a lot about apologetics on the show and different schools of thought. In fact, we're supposed to have a presuppositional v kind of evidential or classical debate. So I don't know where you stand kind of on that question. I mean, that firmly is in the realm of epistemology and philosophy of knowledge and sort of how you know what you know. And there's in the kind of Van Tillian school, there's a reliance on scripture, of course, being the word of God, the inerrant word of God. It cannot err. And also in that school, there's a kind of certainty that the presuppositional school holds, which I appreciate, as opposed to what they would consider to be a probability in the evidential or classical school. And even if it's a 99.99% probability, it's still a probability. And last thought, when you talk about Habermas and the
minimal
facts, those are all probabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
The best bet.
This number of scholars agree that Jesus, the tomb was empty, and this number of scholars agree that this happened, and this number of scholars, those are all probabilities. Now, granted, when you add up all the probabilities, it's like almost a 1 in a million that it's not true, but it's still a probabilistic argument. Do you oppose that as an epistemological ground, or are you really maybe you're also in the evidential school, but you just think that the evidences they're marshaling scripturally it's a weaker case?
Okay, good question. So I got to try to do this succinctly.
I put that word in the email now.
It was a very loaded question.
It was.
No, just only in the sense of a lot being packed into it. Not in the sense of unfair or anything. I am a rampaging evidentialist. My husband Tim and I are just about as evidentialist as it is possible to get. In fact, I went to a presuppositionalist Bible college at one point, but left that I left that behind long ago. Definitely not a presuppositionalist. And yes, it's just that I don't think that the evidential argument they are making is doing it in the right way. And just very briefly, I noticed that you said about percentages of scholars who think things and so forth. One problem I have there is that I think Dr. Habermas is sometimes just misreading the scholars. So that's one problem right to begin with. I think he's misinterpreting some of the scholars. But another thing is, I don't really care what a percentage of scholars say.
Right.
I mean, in other words, I'm going straight for the evidences, even if I'm disagreeing with the consensus of scholarship. I don't think that makes a very strong case. And in fact, I think you have to go up head to head more with the consensus of scholarship at an earlier stage, not in a presuppositional way, but just because you kind of have to dig down farther and reject more of the things that the consensus of scholars is assuming before you can build back up that case. But it's still all going to be done in a very robustly evidential way. So it's probably my best quick answer to that question.
That's fantastic.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
I like it. I like when someone's unapologetic. I'm in this camp. I love it. I own it. It's great. Yeah. So when you do look for evidence that the Bible is true, and of course, when I say the Bible, we're mostly today going to be talking about the Gospels. The Gospels, of course, if people don't know, are the books that talk about Jesus' life. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels in the Bible. And there's a lot of things said in there that people think is crazy. But when you approach those and you're trying to decide if they're true, of course, you've landed on the fact that they are. What's your approach?
Well, first of all, I want to understand what they're saying. So, I've got to read them, maybe read various translations, blah, 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 check out things like that if there's some disagreement about, even what Jesus was saying in a certain place. But then what I'm doing is I'm trying to use an inference to the best explanation to try to figure out what's the best model of what these authors were like. I find that a lot of times there's a surprising lack of curiosity about what the authors were like. So sometimes it's like, I think a scholar like Dr. Ehrman thinks we already know what they were like. So,
yeah.
We already, we
scholars there.
We scholars, we already know they were making some stuff up and so forth, and I've dubbed the approach that I've come up with the reportage model, but it's not anything like highly technical. I usually define it briefly as the authors were always trying to get it right. And here I mean in literal historical terms, not just at some theological level, but in terms of like actual historical statements being made. And they were highly successful. I just published a Facebook status with a Venn diagram a couple days ago. If you follow my author page on Facebook, and a Venn diagram, you've got these ovals and you got an oval inside another oval or overlapping or whatever. Okay.
Kamala Harris loves them. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, no, anyway.
Keep going. Sorry. I just had to say that.
I didn't know that. Anyway, so I had a Venn diagram that said reportage model, like that's the outside one. And then I had a Venn diagram completely, like an oval completely within it that said traditional inerrancy. So traditional inerrancy is entirely within reportage, but then there's space that's in reportage that's outside of the traditional
Right.
inerrancy oval. So what that means is if you're a traditional inerrantist, that entails the reportage model. Like you
Yeah.
literally cannot be a traditional inerrantist unless you think that the gospel authors were always trying to get it literally right and that they were highly successful. But you could be a reportage model person while thinking that they sometimes made good faith errors.
Right.
What the traditional inerrantist will always agree with the reportage model person about, though, is that they were never deliberately changing anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they did make an error, it was an accident.
Right.
It wasn't something they changed on purpose. So that's like a brief introduction to my reportage model.
Okay, so you're reading through Matthew or Mark or Luke, and
Mhm.
you read something that seems weird or maybe contrary to something else that you
Mhm.
know about from the Bible. But and so then your model is they're doing the best that they could. They're real people to tell the true story of what happened. Then what do you do when you hit something that's weird or seems contradictory?
Right. So, and of course, weird and contradictory are very different kinds of issues, right?
Yes.
I mean, something can be seemingly contradictory without being weird, and something can be weird without being seemingly
Hey
contradictory.
guys, Sarah Stone here. Sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a riveting podcast episode, but Theology by the Pint needs your help to continue providing these podcasts, offering our in person events, and growing so we can bring thoughtful conversation and the hope of the gospel to a world that's increasingly walking away from church and from faith. Now that we're a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations are tax deductible. So we've crunched the numbers. And if each listener of this episode gave just $1 for each episode you listen to, we'd put a huge dent in our annual budget. So consider giving today. Go to theologybythePint.org/give and click the link to donate. Thanks so much. And now back to our show.
But let's go with contradictory for the minute. Some
Okay.
alleged discrepancy,
Right.
and Lord Ehrman's got a ton of these, right?
Yes.
So if it can be reasonably harmonized, and of course, different people are going to be disagreeing about that in a way that would make sense in a common sense way with ordinary stuff like history, then I think that's a reasonable way to go. You're not special pleading. You're not saying I gotta make these come together because I gotta believe that the Bible is the perfect, inspired, inerrant word of God. But instead, you're saying, well, why not? So I'll give you a quick example.
I was going to say we're going to need an example.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I do a lot of this on my YouTube channel. I really want to plug my YouTube channel here. So, all right.
Okay.
So the temple cleansing, right? This is when Jesus went in there and he drove out the money changers and he
Yeah.
flipped the tables and all this stuff. Okay. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes called the Synoptic Gospels,
Yeah.
quite firmly, I would say, state that Jesus did an act like that at the end of his ministry in the week right before he died. Okay. John, I think, quite firmly indicates that Jesus did an act like that right at the beginning of his ministry. So,
Okay.
like first, it's right there. It's in John 2, and I think John's pretty explicit about it that it was the shortly after he began his ministry.
Mhm.
All right, is that even a contradiction? I mean,
I mean, not necessarily. Could have done it twice.
Exactly. Okay, now I make an analogy. I'm pro-life. I have stood in front of the same abortion clinic on more than one occasion, holding a sign, sometimes even the same sign. I mean,
Right.
I don't mean physically the same sign, but I mean the sign that said
Same
the same
message.
same thing. Maybe even had the same, like logo on it or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Standing there, but I distinctly remember one time in November and I distinctly remember one time in February.
Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, people even yelled some of the same insults when they drove past, and it was even the same Planned Parenthood. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you could describe that in ways that it's like, oh, come on, how similar is this? But it's not really uncannily similar. And it's also not uncannily similar in the Gospels. For example, there's no verbatim dialogue that is similar in the two different stories. It's not like, people come up and question Jesus and they say the exact same thing. He says the exact same thing back in response and they say the back, there's nothing like that.
Right.
Aside from the general similarities, and this is something Craig Blomberg points out, that aside from the general similarities of the type of thing it is, you could just think of it as a protest. And then if those guys went back and they started selling and doing the stuff that had ticked Jesus off the same time, they started doing it again, he could have come back later and done a similar type of protest. So that's an example of when you say, what's my approach? Where I'm saying, if I apply common sense here, by the way, that's not even a miracle. Okay.
Yeah.
Like going in there and overthrowing the tables, there's nothing even miraculous about that. It's not even all that weird. That Jesus is he's a controversial figure and this is what he's doing. So when you read Bart Ehrman writing about that, he's going to make it sound crazy, like you're just a goofball Christian if you think that. And, unfortunately, I've even seen William Lane Craig say, we do not need to resort to such, I believe he used the term such a strained theory as that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, or he might have been artificial. It was artificial or strained. I don't think that's artificial or strained. And I think the analogy of a political protest or an ideological protest helps us to see that it's not strained. So I think that's a good illustration of my harmonistic approach that's driven by common sense and by evidential considerations.
Yeah.
I know that's really just kind of an example, but I'm curious if you've ever heard the argument that he's actually fulfilling the law in Leviticus where the priest goes to visit a house, and if there's like leprous stuff on the wall, then they have to clean out the house, and then the priest will come back and visit again and make another judgment on it. So some people have said he's visiting his father's house. He finds it to be full of disease, and then he's going back the second time as the priest is supposed to do, and he's finding it and wanting again. So
I love that.
I don't know.
I had never heard that. An argument I might make against that is that in John, it appears that he had been in Jerusalem in between. And even in John 10, it says he was walking in Solomon's porch, and that was, in the temple precincts. So I doubt that was the very next time.
Gotcha.
So that might be an argument against that theory.
Yeah, interesting. But it's a great example, right? And so the point is that Jason Lyle has a book where he goes through a lot of these contradictions as well. And he says, well, this is a logical fallacy, or, and it's a lot of that. It's like the women at the tomb would be another good example, where Mary is at the tomb alone, so to speak, seemingly in some of the gospel accounts. And then there are 5 women in other accounts. Well, you can have Mary there and also have 4 other women. It doesn't exclude Mary. You know what I mean? Is that another example, or? Right.
Well, now I would apply that to her initially going there. I would say for sure, to say that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to the tomb, says Matthew, right? And so obviously for those two to come doesn't mean that Joanna wasn't also with them. Luke mentions Joanna, right? And okay. But I think later when Mary encounters Jesus, Mary Magdalene, that is, encounters Jesus, told only in John 20, I think there where she's weeping and he comes, I think she is alone. Okay. So I would want to distinguish her initially, they're initially traveling to the tomb. Absolutely. To say this woman was there doesn't mean doesn't mean that the other women didn't come as well. But the way I like to say that is, you could be part of a group, but they're not chained together, right? You can leave the group if you've ever gone to a concert.
Autonomy.
A concert or a conference. It's like, you're with this group and then somebody's like, I got to go to the bathroom or whatever, they go away. So I think they came together. And I think when they saw that the stone was rolled away and they're like, what's going on? Has someone taken the body? I think Mary Magdalene took off and ran back. And then the way I say it is that the synoptic camera goes with the other women, and that John's camera goes.
I love that imagery. That's very
Mary
cool.
Magdalene, right? Yeah. And I call this Unexpected Harmonies, and that's the title of one of my chapters in Testimonies to the Truth, that it's a surprising fact that reasonable common sense harmonization works so often
Yeah.
in the Gospels that if we get away from that sort of snooty, I'm making a gesture here for those of you who are just listening, sticking my nose in the air, kind of
Yes.
harmonization, if we get away from that and recognize it as commonsensical, it's kind of surprising that it works that often, and that is itself a kind of evidence for the veracity of the
Yes.
documents.
Yes. Okay. I know this wasn't in the notes that I sent you earlier, but since I brought up weird and seeming contradictions, you went to the seeming contradictions. I have to just ask, I don't have to, but I want to. Again, you're reading these things as a Christian, you already believe it, but still help us out when someone who maybe is on the fence to whether they believe the Bible is true or not, and they read something bizarre. And the one that comes to mind, you don't have to choose this one, you can choose your own, but the one that comes to mind is in Mark when Jesus has the conversation with the woman and he essentially calls her a dog. The eating the scraps under the table. Now, I've studied that and I understand that he's not calling her a dog, and it has to do with Israel and Gentiles and whatever, but I only know that because I've studied that passage. But when you hit something that's weird, maybe pick your own or pick that one, then what's your approach? Like, because there's a lot of things in the Bible that, especially because it was written so long ago in a whole different culture, a whole different context, that we modern readers scratch our heads and we're like, that's weird. It might not be true,
So in that case, I think the weirdness comes from the personality of Jesus in a sense. And I would agree with you too. There's a certain failure to, for example, the word for dog, he could have used an even more insulting word for dog. And no, seriously, that it's
I know.
like house dog instead of, cur, or whatever, street dog. So there, becoming, of course, acquainted with language terminology helps, but also because we're tempted to think of Jesus as this really sweet guy. And I actually think that the unexpected nature of Jesus' personality is part of the evidence for the truth of these documents. So Jesus can be very sarcastic. And you find that across them when he says, um, it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. And that's really sticking the knife in, or when they're gonna stone him. For which of my good works are you stoning me? I mean, he's really,
he has some snark.
He's got some snark. And I think that there too, there's this, I think C.S. Lewis called it the intolerable sternness of his personality, that he's not maybe what we are primed to expect, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's a different kind of weirdness, though, which can be exaggerated by the way that skeptics will put things. Okay, but I'll give an example of they'll call it the zombie passage in Matthew.
I love the zombies. Let's go.
Okay, they'll call it the Saints Rising, and they love to use the word zombies. It's like they'll use the term God is, the invisible spaghetti monsters. It's just it's a way to mock or whatever, and the gospel doesn't say they were zombies, but anyway, okay, any more than Lazarus was. But anyway, that the tombs were opened and that they rose and came into the city, and there's a tendency to just go, that's weird. Now, I want to ask people sometimes, okay, is it just because it's a miracle? And some skeptics would just straight up say, yeah, I think all miracles are weird.
Right.
But in other cases, they'll just say, no, I think it's even weirder. And I think sometimes for that one, they have trouble putting their finger on like what's weirder about it. My own theory about why that Matthew passage strikes people as even weirder than other miracles is that it's so short. I said this to somebody once, and he said, you're right. That there are all kinds of things we would like to know more about. Like, how long did these guys stay around? How did people know?
Did they die again? Did
they die again? How did people know that they had risen from the dead? If they were from like long ago, like nobody had photographs, so how did they know who they were, that they had even been dead? Blah, blah, blah. And I would tend to conclude from that Matthew may have had it at second hand. I don't mean third hand, fourth hand, fifth hand, but that, he's not claiming to have seen one of these people. Contrast that with the story of Lazarus' resurrection in
Right.
John. That has all these, I would say, very realistic details
Yes.
that are the mark of an eyewitness. Even
Yes.
even Martha saying he's going to stink by this time or whatever.
Yeah.
That the beloved disciple was actually there, but not so with the Matthew passage. And I think once you take that into account, that it's just short and seems to indicate that maybe Matthew didn't know any more about it than just what he said there.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of the weirdness goes away. So, and
Yeah.
beyond it's just being a miracle. So I think sometimes what we want to say to ourselves is, why does this strike me as weird?
Yeah, that's
Is it
good.
because it seems overly harsh? Is it because it seems short? Is it because I'm accepting some skeptic's derogatory way of describing, or what,
Yeah.
what exactly is it? And that can help.
Man, this is so fun. I
Yeah.
like this. And I agree with you about that. The shortness of it. We want more detail, although it is kind of ironic that people stumble over something where dead people come back to life. And it's kind of like, well, if you don't like that, you're not going to like the next couple chapters.
Just wait.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of like the hinge of the whole story. But okay, so in your new book, you sent me a copy of the book, but also just the table of contents, which was fascinating. And I've seen some of this language maybe on some of your other writings, but some of the titles are things like, or some of the chapter titles are things like location, location, or unnecessary details, or unmistakable Jesus, unified personalities, all these kind of things. But you mentioned one of them earlier when you were talking. You said that your husband introduced you to the concept of undesigned coincidences.
Mm-hmm.
So I had on here to pick a couple of those and kind of tell us what they are and maybe give us examples. But now I'm kind of particularly interested in that one. And maybe if you want to pick that and another one to kind of explain to us what they are and how they're used.
For sure. Absolutely. So I call undesigned coincidences incidental interlockings that point to truth.
Say that again.
Incidental interlockings that point to truth.
Okay.
Incidental interlockings. And a modern, this made up example that I give that get people right into it is suppose that there is a bank robbery and you have multiple people at the bank robbery, or at least that say they were at the bank robbery, and police interview them. And one person says, the bank robber tripped as he was running away. That's part of that person's narrative.
Sure.
And then the police go and they interview somebody else. And that other person is describing the bank robber's clothes. And he says, and I noticed that he had tennis shoes on and one of his tennis shoes was untied.
Ooh. Yeah.
Okay. So the untied tennis shoe could explain why the person tripped.
Yeah.
Guy who says he tripped doesn't say his tennis shoe was untied. The guy who says his tennis shoe was untied doesn't say he tripped.
Right.
But
they
the
connect.
fact that they connect gives us greater confidence in the truth of both of them.
I love that.
And I've even got
a third guy that said there was a banana peel. Just kidding.
Oh, that would be an interesting case, but I actually have a professional article actually analyzing the probability theory of this without any reference to the Gospels. So that's one of those crossover things I mentioned. So in the Bible, so I'm going to give a example from the Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, at Jesus' trial before the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, they say, some of the witnesses against him say, he said, I will destroy this temple and raise it up again in 3 days.
Yeah.
And it sounds sort of weird. It's like if they're just trying to make him sound bad.
They didn't pick the right thing.
Well, why even say raise it up again in 3 days?
Right. Just say he's going to destroy the temple.
Say he's going to destroy it. Like if we want to make somebody sound like a terrorist and we're going to tell a lie about him, and you're going to say, he said I'm going to carry a bomb on an airplane and blow the airplane up. We're not going to add, and then I'm going to put the airplane back together again. Right. I mean,
right.
Obviously, if these people are just lying about him, why the raise it up again in 3 days thing? So if we heard something like that nowadays, we'd all be on Google. We'd all be searching. Like that sounds like maybe something he like what he really said, but it got distorted somehow, to try to find out what might lie behind this.
Sure.
In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is no explanation of what lies behind it. You're not going to find it. If you only Google Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're not going to find it.
Okay.
But if you go to John, and John doesn't have that story about that part about
Right. In the trial.
in the trial. But if you go to John in John 2, after he cleanses the temple, they come up to him and they say, show us a sign of your authority to do this. Like, who do you think you are, basically?
Yeah.
And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And of course he was referring to himself.
And it actually, John does what is called an aside. And this he said concerning the temple of his body.
I like when John does that. It helps. It's like Bible for dummies.
Well, here, I'm going to make a parenthesis here.
Yes.
That's evidence of John's truthfulness, because, scholars who think John is changing things think he felt free to put things in Jesus' mouth if they were things Jesus would have said, or if they were, if they were true to Jesus' message or whatever. And that was the kind of thing Dr. Evans said that I was mentioning that I became aware of in 2017. He said something different, but it was kind of like this, right? But the asides show that the narrator is scrupulously distinguishing between what he thinks Jesus meant and what the historical Jesus actually said.
Yeah.
A guy who thinks it's okay for him to put stuff in Jesus' mouth because it's what Jesus would have said. He could have just had Jesus and the disciples later, and they're like, hey, Jesus, what did you mean by that? And Jesus said, I was referring to the temple of my body. He could have just made up a scene like that. It didn't really happen if he thought that was okay. Instead, he stops, pauses the quote, and says, well, now I'm going to tell you what I think he meant.
Yeah.
But he doesn't pretend that Jesus historically gave that explanation. So that, and John does say it a lot, and I love it because to me, all by itself, it practically destroys that image of John's freedom. But okay, back to the undesigned coincidence.
In parenthesis.
But in parenthesis. So that's the undesigned coincidence, that what he said there 3 years earlier or whatever it was explains that it's had time to get distorted somewhat and give rise to the slightly surprising testimony that you find at his trial later. That's an example.
Man, this is so good. I love it. I'm realizing maybe I need to read this book. Good thing I have a copy of it.
I want to ask just a quick question of what do you think of this was a huge book that went around, and I want people to read your books first. And by the way, I use the very briefly summarizing the undesigned coincidences in a video series I created, which is like for our confirmation in the Lutheran world, but it's also for people who don't know anything about Christianity at all. So I do quote you in that. So appreciate your work on that. I think it's excellent evidence. And actually, what do they call it in a trial? It's not like physical or forensic evidence, but circumstantial. That's some of the best evidence. I don't know why people
learned that from J. Warner Wallace.
Yeah. Okay. But I forgot what I was going to say.
Book. There's a book. Read her books first.
Richard Balcom, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. What do you think? I'm just curious if do you like that book? Or
it's a very interesting book. I agree with much of it. I don't agree with absolutely all of it, but who agrees with all of, a given book? I would say there are places where Balcom says that, particularly in the synoptics, he thinks maybe they felt free to make some changes deliberately, and I'm going to disagree with him there. And I also disagree with him that the author of John was a different John.
Yeah.
So there's a disagreement. But he brings up a lot of really interesting stuff. And one thing that's really good that he does there is the name statistics argument. And I did an entire series recently responding to some skeptics who claimed to have debunked the name statistic argument. And so I really agree with him about that. And very briefly, that's the idea that the distribution that we find of the names in the Gospels, and they'll sometimes put in a second name, like the son of Judah or whatever. So and
Simon the Tanner.
Yes, right, exactly. Maybe give his occupation, or give his father or his brother or whatever, right? But the distribution of those names bears an uncanny resemblance to what we've been able independently to confirm was the distribution of names among Jews at the time and place. And that's really, I think it's true, and it would be a very hard thing to fake. I mean, I myself would have trouble telling you, like if I wanted to write a novel or something, exactly which were the most popular name. I found myself recently like Sarah seems like a really popular name nowadays, but I don't know like how popular, and how popular is it with the H on the end or not with the H on the end, or whatever. And I could look all this stuff up, but they couldn't look all that stuff up. And we even find some extension of Baucham's argument there that I've been able to do is to look at a novel, a historical novel called The Spear by a Catholic author named Louis de Wohl. And that guy's using Josephus, and he's clearly trying really hard to get things accurate, but he has no clue about name statistics. He thinks, even though he's using Josephus, he thinks, well, they're doing like a lot of Old Testament names. So he just goes and grabs a lot of old for his side characters, because in a novel you're making up characters. And it doesn't follow the actual name statistics of the time at all. So
interesting.
This is hard. This is hard to do, but it would arise very naturally, of course, if these stories really happened and they're just telling you the names of the people in the story. So,
or if it was a Russian fiction novel, because they have a lot of names. Woo! Try reading Anna Karenina.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Man, oh man. Anyway,
but I have no idea how realistic they are to the time either. I've never researched it, but.
Well, yeah, no, I love anything about the Bible that's like, hey, this would have been hard to fake or weird to fake. It like the centrality of the women that would be sort of absurd for that time, were it not that it was true and they wanted to just say what was true, that kind of stuff. The argument from absurdity,
or that like sycamores grow in that part of the world, they grow in Houston and they grow in Jerusalem, but they don't grow in a lot of other places. So,
well, they were especially, prominent in Jericho, and we find Luke actually distinguishing, it doesn't come across in some of our translations, but the sycamore from the sycamine tree. And I'm not saying that we can definitely confirm that a sycamine tree was popular in that place, but I think it shows an attention to detail.
Yeah.
That he's not just, grabbing anything, but that he's actually trying to get down what Jesus actually said.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask, we're kind of nerding out now and maybe taking off course, but no. I mean, it's my fault. But the story where Jesus has the coin with Caesar on it, do you know anything about that? Like, is that evidence of anything, or was a coin with Caesar on it so prolific that it, wouldn't have mattered?
Well, it's not that it wasn't common. Now, what my husband likes to point to, Tim McGrew, is that it could have been offensive to Jews, but that Jesus is making a play on whose image is on this. And then he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. And that they, as Jews, of course, believe that they are made in God's image.
That's right. Yep.
So there's definitely that. I think we also find evidence of coins in Matthew. For example, Jesus tells Peter to go get a coin out of a fish's mouth and pay the tax. And it's a stater, which in fact would pay the tax. He says, pay the tax for you and me. And in fact, it would be double the amount that the tax actually was. Which is the kind of thing that Matthew, if he was indeed a tax collector for the Romans, he just would have an interest, not the taxes, the temple tax, but he would have had an interest in monetary matters, so his attention would be drawn to that kind of thing.
And
interesting.
That may sound like a small thing, but like with the names, coinage, agriculture, those things all kind of add up.
Yeah.
And it's like the joke is like every Christmas when people start looking at, say, Home Alone, and they're like, if you remember the scene where Macaulay Culkin or Kevin McAllister goes to the grocery store and he gets like all this stuff and it's like $20 and people are like, today that would cost $75 to get the milk and the pizza and then laundry detergent and stuff. So it would it would be wrong if you because things change. The point is that things change. So if the reportage model is that they're reporting things accurately and they get as I've heard, I don't know who said this, but like if they get the smaller things correct incidentally, then you used the word incidental, I think earlier,
Mhm.
then the likelihood that they get the big things correct, like Jesus' words and the resurrection and things of that
Yeah.
nature, it gives it credibility.
Yeah.
Well, and this is why I call it an inference to the best explanation. And it's why I call reportage a model. What is our best model of what these authors were like? And something I strongly disagree with is what I call a smorgasbord model. You know, when you go to a smorgasbord, you get a little bit of this and a little bit of that, right? And in the smorgasbord model, it's like, well, yeah, you know, sometimes they're telling the truth. You know, maybe they're telling the truth about how much somebody got paid per day, a denarius or whatever. But then other times, you know, John felt free to move the temple cleansing or make up this saying of Jesus that he didn't recognizably say or whatever. And hey, you know, why does it have to be all one way or all the other? Well, logically, it doesn't, you know, absolutely have to be, but what's the best model? Okay, if we want to have a psychologically unified portrait, if you have a friend, you find that you develop a psychologically unified portrait of your friend after you know him for a while
Mm.
that makes sense, you know, of how careful he is about things or how often you found him to be correct about something, et cetera, et cetera. You don't say, well, maybe then it's just some, you know, random other place to make a better story. He's going to tell me something that didn't really happen. Like that's not common sense. And so this is where I say on my channel, my YouTube channel, making common sense rigorous. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make common sense rigorous.
I like that. That thing you just described, does that have anything to do? One of the other chapter titles is Unified Personalities. Is that connected? What is that? Tell us about unified personalities.
So no, I mean, it's understandable that you would ask that because I'm talking about unified personality of the authors.
Yeah.
In that chapter, I'm actually talking about the unified personality of the people in the stories,
Okay.
some of whom are the authors, of course.
Sure.
But so an example here would be, of course, Jesus. We already talked about him being kind of snarky and these things that we find across stories that are in different gospels. I broke that out as a separate chapter, you know, that I called Unmistakable Jesus. In the Unified Personality chapter, I talked about characters other than Jesus. Peter being a really good example here.
Okay.
That we find that Peter is so unmistakable as a person,
Yes.
even in stories that are found in completely different gospels. And that's harder to be consistent about than you might think.
Yeah.
Even in our own day, if you binge watch a television show, you will find, and these authors of the different shows, they could have watched all the earlier ones. Sometimes they just don't care. You know, they're just going to make the person inconsistent.
Yeah.
Because they want to follow their artistic vision, you know, and you have different writers, you know, for different episodes.
Right.
But it's not like that with Peter. So for example, on the mountain of transfiguration, when he says, let's build 3 tabernacles,
Yes.
one for each of you, and so forth. And there's an older writer who said from the 1800s who said, can we imagine any other one of the disciples saying this?
Right.
Like if somebody said, which disciple do you think said this? And you didn't already
it's the
know.
impetuous, but
Yeah,
childlike faith kind of, yes.
Foot in mouth disease,
Yes.
you know, that he has. He also has what I call loving argumentativeness. And so
I think I have that.
You have loving
I just have
argumentativeness. I'm not
I'm
going to
not
ask
loving it yet.
not going to ask your husband. Anyway, you know, so where Jesus says, I'm going to die. And in the synoptics, you know, he pulls Jesus aside and he says, no, you're not. You're gonna die. Well, why does he? And Jesus like really tells him,
Yeah, get thee behind me.
Yeah, you know, right? But why? Because he loves him. He can't even
Right.
he can't handle that. Well, now compare that to the foot washing, which is in John, not the synoptics, where he says, you're never gonna wash my feet.
Yeah.
You know, and we learn of Richard Bauckham points this out. Foot washing was a lowly slave. I mean, like even if you had slaves, if you didn't have a lowly enough slave,
Yeah.
They wouldn't wash the feet. It was
Yeah.
really, really degrading. And Peter is shocked. That's
Right.
that loving argumentativeness. Or
Yeah.
in John, Peter says, why can't I follow you now?
Yeah.
Jesus says, you can't follow me now, but you'll follow me later, Peter.
Yeah.
And it's like heartbreaking. Why can't I follow you now? I'll die for you. It's like, oh, Peter, man, but that's who he is. And it would be surprising if we found the authors drilling down and going, I'm going to make up like a completely different story about Peter, but it's gonna highlight this same loving argumentativeness
Yeah.
facet of his personality. That would be surprising, and I think somewhat
Yes.
anachronistic. I don't think works of that time really specialized in psychological realism. That
Exactly.
they were fictional. So anyway, that's an example of unified personalities.
Okay.
What do you think about the Q theory? Not QAnon, but the Quell source. The idea that the Synoptic Gospels had access to the same material, which was like the written something, the spoken words of Jesus or something, or do you have a prioritization of Gospels? Say Mark wrote first, most people believe, and then Matthew or Luke had access to Mark, and then Matthew or Luke the other had access to both, because you do find almost word for word reproductions, it seems like, in the Gospels. And I think that the critics of the New Testament will say, aha, these aren't independent actors who are historically reporting eyewitness testimony. A lot of their work is copied. Some percentage of Mark is exactly like Matthew, or vice versa, and you get the idea. So I'm curious if you think Q is legit, or if there's a prioritization, and if there is some copying going on, if
Does that hurt our case?
Does it hurt the case?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we want to distinguish the hypothesis that there was a document that scholars call Q, just because they don't, have a name for it, from the question of which gospel of the synoptics was written first, because the Q hypothesis doesn't even cover all of the similarities by itself. It is only with reference to the material that is found in both Matthew and Luke, but is not found in Mark. So Q material is actually common to Matthew and Luke, but not to Mark.
Oh, okay.
Now, the two source, what's normally called the two source hypothesis, Mark is one of the sources and Q is the other source. So that's how that fits together. And by the way, I can't quite resist the temptation to brag a little bit here. You will find people who will say Lydia McGrew is unfamiliar with the synoptic problem. But the very fact that I just said that right now, it shows that I'm not unfamiliar with the synoptic problem. You get these
Funny.
People will say anything. But anyway, so as far as the prioritization, I am open to Mark in priority. I'm not really eager to challenge that, but only in the extremely limited sense of Mark writing first and then Matthew and Luke having access to Mark and at times using him as a literary source, not in the sense that is often used, and these will be mushed together. It's a technical term, mushed, that conflated, that if you have a story that's found in Matthew and Luke, or Matthew or Luke, that's also found in Mark, that they had no other factual evidence about it. So that if there's anything factually different, then they must have made that up. Okay, or change that. And so something that I'm really big on is partial independence. And we have to recognize that possibility. Indeed, the very fact that there are sometimes alleged discrepancies in these in these very stories shows the probability of some degree of independence. So it's not
obviously
an absolute either or, even on those stories that are the same, that are found in all three of the synoptic gospels. So what I think is quite plausible is, let's say Mark was written first, and let's say Matthew was like, gee, I mean, there's no concept of plagiarism here that's a problem, you know? Like, I don't need to make up all this Greek all over again. Here, I'll take some notes on Mark and then I'll use some of that. But he could also supplement that when there was something that he knew. So to give just a little example, in the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter, only in Matthew do we find a mention that there were flute players among the mourners. Okay. And so
So
from
random.
it was very random. And so from among the the wrong kind of Markan priority concept, it would just be assumed that that's a Matthean redaction, meaning he made it up, and stuck it in there because it's like if he's somewhat using Mark, then he's entirely factually dependent, and nothing else can be factual that he's bringing into the story.
Mhm.
So that I would reject, and I would say
Yeah.
that many of the things that are taken to be arguments for Matthew or Lucan redactions are actually evidence for independence.
That's right. That's
To
right.
at least some degree. So that's a partial answer to your question there.
I love it. Okay, let's get to the spicy stuff. Why do you hate Mike Lacona? I'm joking. I'm joking. But we asked him, and I didn't use your name, but I don't remember if he did or not. But I said
Nobody
there are
used my name, but everybody knew it was.
yeah. Well, it's a very niche crowd that knows that there's beef
Sure.
among apologists. It's like we thought that was just for rappers, but turns out apologists sometimes disagree with each other. But we asked him what some people have kind of beef with or take issue with some of what you do. He was supposed to steel man your perspective. You don't think he did a very good job. So unpack, especially if people didn't listen to that episode. I mean, I can't imagine somebody that doesn't listen to every single episode. That's crazy. But let's just say they didn't listen to that. They don't know who Mike Lacona is.
Sure.
What is the difference of opinion between you two?
Sure.
Unpack that for us.
Sure. So I'll try to keep it brief because, as you say, it is somewhat niche. But so, Dr. Lacona is a professor at Houston Christian University, and he works in New Testament, and he's an apologist. And beginning some years ago, even as long ago as his book on the resurrection, his big book on the resurrection, but developed much more in the book that was published called Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And then again recently in a popular level book he published called Jesus Contradicted. He develops this idea that the gospel authors were sometimes changing the facts. And the temple cleansing example that we used before would be a pretty good, sort of brief example here. And sometimes these are bigger, sometimes these are smaller. So one of them that some people might regard as smaller would be that, in Dr. Lacona's opinion, Matthew knew that the centurion did not really come in person to speak to Jesus. He knew that, as it's portrayed in Luke, he sent messengers, to ask for his help, but that Matthew deliberately tried to make it look like he actually came in person, where they're like face to face.
Okay.
Because he wanted to shorten the story, and that Matthew thought that was the best way to shorten it. So that might seem like a relatively small one, but it is a change of a fact. Was he there? Did he deliberately change that fact or not? I myself, I'm not an inerrantist, by the way. I think Matthew may have not been present for that particular incident and misunderstood something he was told and legitimately thought that the man came in person. So that would be a good faith error of the kind that I mentioned before. Okay, but a bigger one would be that Dr. Lacona suggests that either Luke and John on the one hand, or Matthew on the other hand, changed the circumstances under which Jesus first saw his disciples, his male disciples, I should say, after his resurrection. So he believes that there's contradiction here. He wouldn't want to use the word contradiction because he would call it a compositional device, right? But what most of us would call a contradiction, right? That in Matthew, the very first meeting, he would say, takes place in Galilee, and in Luke and John, the very first meeting takes place in Jerusalem. And by the way, that's not a question of like the greater metropolitan area or something. Yeah. Nobody would call Galilee Jerusalem or vice versa. They're several days walk apart from one another, 70, 80 miles. Okay. So this isn't just a matter of terminology. And in fact, in Matthew, it's clearly outside. In Luke and John, it's clearly inside. There are all kinds of differences of circumstance between them. He believes they're both describing the same meeting, but that one or the other deliberately made it different.
Wait. So, let me just interject for a second here. Maybe I'm not remembering my Bible correctly, but are you talking about the story of Jesus cooking for them on the beach right after?
No, that's a different time in John. Okay. That's actually the third time in John.
Okay.
I'm talking about when he comes into the upper room, the very first time.
The upper room, and you're saying that, but what's the Galilee version?
Matthew.
But how's it described? Like,
okay, it says, and so it's like right after the thing about the guard at the tomb, which is kind of a parenthesis for Matthew. And then he says, but the 11 proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain that Jesus had told them of. And he came
okay,
and he came up to them and he said, I forget what he says to
et cetera,
them
et
when he first
cetera.
comes.
Okay.
Okay, right.
But it
That's the
doesn't say they
Galilee
were
one.
behind the closed door and he appeared to them in the room.
It's clearly not in the room. It's clearly outside. I mean, he even
Yeah.
says came up to them. He says to a
Okay.
mountain. You're not going to, a mountain isn't going to fit in a room. So, you know,
Yeah. So
right.
Mike Lacona says those are the same thing, just told very differently.
Uh-huh.
Huh.
And that's
we
what
really
I mean.
need to get them on the same episode.
Yeah.
He won't do it. He's like explicitly refused
Oh,
to do that.
well, that's sad.
But anyway, yeah, he says there one or the other is changing it.
Huh.
Either Matthew is moving it to Galilee or Luke is moving it to Jerusalem. And in a debate with Bart Ehrman several years ago, he actually came down on the side of he said it was Luke who moved it. And it would have to be John as well, because actually John and Luke are in agreement about that meeting in the upper room.
Yeah.
They're clearly both describe that actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so he was more definite about it then. More recently, he said he's not sure which one changed it, but
yeah.
So those are examples, and that's why I call them fact changing, and you can kind of tell why I call them fact changing. Now, what is not at issue between us, and is why I said that wasn't a steel man of my position, but rather what I would call a straw man of my position.
Yes,
is whether the authors ever used completely recognizable figures of speech, like a hyperbole. So the example he gave on your show was that in Mark, the narrator says, all Jerusalem, I think it is, and Judea came out to hear John the Baptist and were being baptized by him in the Jordan River.
Right.
And so he's like, so see, Mark is changing the facts because it wasn't like literally every single person in Jerusalem and Judea came out to hear John the Baptist.
Right.
And that's not what I mean by changing the facts, okay?
Sure.
Because we immediately recognize it's not just
that's
a matter
phrase.
of,
yeah,
that's a phrase, right? That it's a hyperbole. So like if I say I have a frog in my throat, you immediately know that I don't mean that I literally have a frog in my throat. I'm not changing the facts, right?
Yeah.
And so that's not what I'm disagreeing with him about. I'm disagreeing with him about things like these examples I've just given you.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, one of the most striking that I haven't mentioned yet on this show is that when Jesus was on the cross, he never literally said something that would be recognizable as "I am thirsty." This is Mike Lacona's view, and he is getting it from Daniel Wallace, as a matter of fact.
I've
surprising.
heard him
Yeah. That Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as recorded in the Synoptics, and that John was kind of, what should we say, inspired by that, or meditating on that, or whatever, and made him say, "I am thirsty," but in his private mind, he meant that it was like a metaphor. And yet in John, it's clearly not portrayed as a metaphor because they run to get him sour wine when he says it. So it's clear that the surrounding people hear it as, I'm not saying he could have literally said, water, give me water, which John puts down as "I am thirsty," but he did not say anything recognizably as an overt expression of physical thirst.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And I think it's a big deal anyway.
Well, it's a prophecy fulfilled, I think.
Yeah.
John says it fulfills prophecy.
Right.
Yeah, explicitly. So a lot of these things are big deals, but by giving an example like, well, like in Mark, all Jerusalem went out to see John the Baptist, he doesn't literally mean that every single person. That downplays it, makes it seem like there's nothing to it, and it makes me sound like I'm
kind of stupid.
Yeah, hyper rigid, weird, that kind of thing. And so that was why I emailed you and said, no, that's definitely not a straw man, or steel man of my position. So that's a somewhat, at least brief version of what's at issue between us.
No, I actually really appreciate that. I have a follow-up question, and then we really are out of time. But you said something as a quick parenthetical when you were talking about the Jairus story in Matthew, and you said, I'm not an inerrantist.
Mhm.
I think that Matthew actually erroneously thought in the retelling of it, he remembered it differently, right? Like that he.
I thought I said the centurion story. Did I say that right? Both.
You probably said it right.
There
I'm
are
probably
messengers
remembering.
involved in both of them, but I meant to say the centurion.
But
Yeah.
either way, that you think that
Yeah.
Matthew put something in there that's not in one of the other versions that was incorrect, but he put it in there because he remembered it incorrectly.
No, I think he would have had to not have been there. I think it's a big enough difference.
Okay.
It's probably not memory, although you can get memory differences sometime. But I mean, I think if you were there, you would know whether you were, like looking right
Okay.
at that centurion guy. But I think he may have heard someone tell it and in such a fashion that he misunderstood them.
Okay.
And thought that the centurion literally came personally. This may have been before he was called as a disciple. We know that Matthew wasn't called as a disciple at the very outset of
Yeah.
Jesus' ministry, so he may not have been a disciple yet at that time.
I guess my question is, and this is going to be sort of salty, but or snarky, but so is Jesus. So I'm in good company. But if Matthew can make let's call it a mistake like that,
It would be a mistake, yeah.
Then how is that so different from Mike Lacona saying, oh, these things are actually the same. They're told in different ways because they're, Greco-Roman biographies or whatever. I'm not trying to get into that. I already know what you think about the Greco-Roman thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess I'm saying both of you are trying to figure out why something seems off. What makes his version sort of worse than just saying like, well, he got it wrong? Because inerrantants everywhere are now going, what? She's not an inerrantist? Like,
I try not to hide that though. Like I try to be really upfront because I don't want people to say that I hid it. So yeah. Sure. That's an excellent question. No, I'm not offended at all. So I have a couple of videos about this. I can maybe send you some links to them. But to illustrate that, I'm going to give you a little scenario. Okay, so you're on a jury. You're on a jury. Okay,
yeah.
And on this jury, you've got you're watching, and there's a witness, and he's telling about something that happened. And he gets cross-questioned by the opposing lawyer, right? And the opposing lawyer, bam, 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 and forces that guy to admit, you said it was on Saturday, but it was really on Wednesday. Okay. You said it happened on Saturday, but it was really on Wednesday. Okay. So now my scenario is going to split into two scenarios. Okay. So, sub version one, the witness goes, shoot, you're right. Okay, we were doing the same, we went out to dinner at the same restaurant on the Saturday and on the Wednesday, and I misremembered.
I got confused.
Yeah. I got confused. I misremembered it. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Sub scenario two.
Yeah.
The witness goes, yeah, I knew it was a different day. I changed that to make a better story.
Okay.
Now you are on the jury. Which of these two scenarios is going to make a greater difference to your future view of that person's reliability?
Sure. The second one is less reliable. The first one is a lot more reliable.
Way less reliable. Yeah. We as human beings, we develop, yes, informally, a sense of what kind of mistakes people make who are close to the facts. Maybe they were personally there, or maybe they're only one remove further. They've talked to one person who was personally there, and they're habitually honest. They're really trying to get it right. What kind of mistakes do they sometimes make? Okay. And I know it's got fuzzy edges to it, but we do have a sense of that, and we use that in our model of people. You remember earlier we were talking about your model of your friend.
Yeah.
If your friend did that, in a, let's say, non-jury context, and he, you would be like, okay, no problem, man. I get it, right? Okay. But if your friend said, yeah, I knew that, I just changed it for you because I thought it made a better story, you'd be like, dude, I mean, it would make a bigger difference to how much you trusted him, because we do not have a good, clear, understandable, shall we say, limited model of what someone might consider to make a better story
Yes.
or
Yes.
to be worthwhile. Here we've got John privately and all in his own mind. And by the way, in the view that Dr. Laguna suggests, not even the original audience would have been able to recognize this.
Huh.
It would be like a movie based on true events where we don't care if they change stuff, but we can't tell if it's been changed unless we go Google it.
Right.
Okay, it would be more like that. But they had
Right.
no Google back then, so they couldn't go Google it, right?
Indeed.
So okay, so here's John. He's like, I'm a make Jesus say I'm thirsty.
Yes.
Even though I know he didn't say that. That has a way bigger effect.
Sure.
So then Matthew misunderstanding somebody who says, so then the centurion asked Jesus to come heal his servant.
How did he ask?
And so Matthew assumes that he was there in person and it was just misunderstanding. Misunderstandings like that happen all the time. So this is again part of this making common sense rigorous. And that's my answer there, that when I'm talking about real world literal reliability, it is actually a very different model. And this is where I think traditional inerrantists should recognize the resemblance of my way of approaching these things. This is why their Venn diagram oval is entirely within the reportage model.
Yes.
And this is why I harmonize so often, for the same reason that you harmonize what your friend says, not because you're an inerrantist about your friend, but because it's a reasonable common sense thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, that was an amazing metaphor. Please tell me you already had to be in the chamber. You didn't just come up with that on the fly.
The one about the court?
The jury, yeah.
I had that one in the
Okay, I was like, man, oh man, she is. I mean, you're whip smart either way, but that was good. That was really good. This has been such a lovely conversation. I want to ask you a million more questions, but we are well over time. So, and I don't want to keep you, but if people are interested in this and they want to hear more, where can they find you and your material?
Yeah, so you look to lydiamcgrew.com for just various links. But if you want to follow my content, check out Lydia McGrew Author on Facebook and the Lydia McGrew channel on YouTube. Every Sunday, I try to put out a new YouTube video. That content is then ported over by my good friend Eric Manning of Testify channel to the audio content on Lydia McGrew podcast. Prior to November, there's one Lydia McGrew podcast link. From November on due to a technical glitch. There's another Lydia McGrew podcast link. Those are both to be found at lydiamcgrew.com. If you just want to listen, that's the audio content of the videos. If you want to see me wave my hands around and make my funny facial expressions, watch it on the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel.
Okay. By the way, I went to Facebook during this and I realized I put in a request a while back to be your friend and it has not gone through yet. So I'm going to cry about that later. Not the author page.
What? You can you do not have to be my Facebook friend. And by the way, I often make this announcement. I ignore almost all Facebook friend requests. And that's because I post so much as public content. You can even follow my public content on my non-author page when you're not my friend. You can click follow.
I was totally joking. So there's actually no offense there. I was just being silly. Cool. I am very silly. So, but if you're listening and you want to learn more about this, definitely go to her page and either watch or listen. And you can find out everything you need to know about our stuff, as I said earlier, by going to theologybythepint.org. And until we see you next time, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.